Miracles are possible. Sounds crazy, right? Miracles happen to bring people to repentance and ultimately a relationship with Jesus, the Christ. They can happen as a sign to confirm the gospel message, and they reveal God's glory, compassion, and His love, often in response to faith from believers. I just have a few quick examples of miracles that I wanted to show. The first example is of Barbara Kreminsky Snyder, who was miraculously healed from blindness and MS. Essentially, she was on her deathbed, and the next time that she was going to get sick, the doctor said that they weren't going to treat her because they were just delaying the inevitability of her death. Long story short, even though it seemed hopeless, there was a prayer that went out, and she was miraculously healed immediately. Lee Strobel, a former atheist journalist who tried to disprove God and ended up writing The Case for Christ, he interviewed her, and he probably can tell the story a little bit better than me.
I interviewed Barbara at length. We have extensive medical records from her, dating back many years from the Mayo Clinic and her other physicians. We have multiple credible eyewitnesses with no motive to deceive. We have two of her doctors who were so blown away by what happened to her, they wrote about it in books because they said, I got to write about this. This is unbelievable. So let me tell you what happened to Barbara. Barbara was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the Mayo Clinic. One of her physicians, Dr. Harold P. Adolph, a board-certified surgeon who had performed 25,000 operations in his career, he called Barbara, quote, one of the most hopelessly ill patients I ever saw. Hopelessly ill.
June 7th, 1981, I'll never forget it. It was a day like any other day for me. That was one spent confined to bed, unable to breathe on my own, hooked up to machines, a tracheostomy tube in my neck, my arms curled up, my legs curled up. I lay there trapped inside my own body is really how it felt. I had two friends over. They came over all the time. So while they were there, I still remember exactly what they were reading when all of a sudden I heard a booming, authoritative, loud voice over my shoulder over here say, my child, get up and walk. And I said, I don't know what you're going to think about this, but God just told me to get up and walk. My friends all of a sudden jumped up, and while they jumped, so did I. And I literally jumped out of the bed. This is where you'd almost have to know me to see how totally impossible that was. And as I jumped up, the first thing I remember isn't what I would think I would remember, but I jumped out of the bed and I looked and I saw my feet. They were flat on the ground, just like everyone else's, which sounds normal, but not for me. I had foot drops so badly I couldn't even wear slippers on my feet. They were so curled. So when I jumped up to have feet flat, I was amazed and stood staring at my feet. And when I did that, I jumped like this, and then I saw my hands. And they were open, and they never opened. And so now they were open, and I stood staring at them, and then it dawned on me I could see me. We all started jumping up and down, screaming and thanking the Lord. I remember I didn't understand anything, except where once I was real sick, I was well again.
The next morning, she went to one of her doctors, Dr. Thomas Marshall, an internist for 30 years. His response was this, quote, this is medically impossible. And one of her doctors wrote this, quote, I have never witnessed anything like this before or since, and considered it a rare privilege to observe the hand of God performing a true miracle.
Needless to say, that Sunday night service after getting healed was probably pretty lit. The next example is of Dr. Sean George of Kalgoorlie Hospital in, I think, Western Australia. This poor guy was unfortunate enough to have to read his own ECG because he's a medical doctor. I think he's a cardiologist. He was able to tell the doctors, hey, I can confirm I'm having a heart attack. And he ended up dying. And after his wife prays for him, he comes back to life.
And by this time, the CPR had gone on for well over an hour. We're talking about 6,000 or more chest compressions. And still, I was dead. So you can imagine, the state that my wife was in. And while she was coming to Kambalda, she actually had a call from her father. And he said, look, I know you're a doctor. I know this looks really, really bad. But you go there and pray. God can do the impossible. So when she walked into that room, all the doctors, the nurses, everyone was standing back except the one who was actually giving me a bit of oxygen through the endotracheal tube. And she saw me, I was white. I know you don't believe that, but I was. And the ECG monitor was actually a flat line. She held my hand, it was cold. And she just closed her eyes, and in that moment, she just prayed a very simple prayer. She said, Lord, Sean's 39, I'm 38. We have a 10-year-old boy. I need a miracle. And the moment she said that in her heart, beep, 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 my heartbeat came back. Now, you can imagine there was so much of confusion there because they can't send me to the morgue anymore. This is just a blood test to show that I had a massive heart attack. This is called a troponin test. This is the blood test that we do to see whether you've had a heart attack. This is the liver function test. I had a normal liver, and that had failed, and then it started to come good on its own. I had kidney failure. I actually had to have dialysis 6 times before my kidneys started to come good. All of this is evidence that there was multi-organ damage. But the brain, which should have been damaged first, because the brain cannot be starved of oxygen. The brain has no metabolism without oxygen. My brain was 100% normal.
The last example is just one that I really like. It's Dahlia Knox, who was hit by a drunk driver, and she was paralyzed from the waist down for over 20 years. Her muscles had completely atrophied, and they were actually at church at a prayer service, and the pastor prayed for her. I know that she was reluctant to probably believe what the pastor was saying, but she got a miracle that night, and it's on video.
I didn't like going to altar calls because every time I would go somewhere, the service would change to a healing service and somebody would try to pull me out of the chair, and I've been plopped, dropped, flopped, and flipped, and to the point where I was like, I just can't go through that anymore.
By 2010, Dahlia had been in a wheelchair for over 22 years. In August, she and her husband attended a conference hosted by evangelist Nathan Morris.
The evangelist went up and he started speaking on healing and all that. Had I known it was a healing service, I have to be honest, I would have never gone.
She was at the front of the church with her husband when Pastor Morris started praying for her.
Here I am confined for 22 and a half years in this wheelchair. And for the first time in the longest time, I find myself that something could possibly really be happening. I said, I'm feeling something in my legs.
With the assistance of her husband, Dahlia slowly rose. She later stumbled and sat back down, fighting to block out the doubts flooding her mind.
I remember the words that he prayed were, let faith arise in this woman of God.
Then her husband and Pastor Morris helped her back on her feet. She took a few steps on her own. Then, as the congregation sang and prayed, Dahlia started walking around the church.
Paraplegics will tell you that you can move on your hips. And so I thought, was I moving on my hips? I just started moving my knees up and down, and I started bouncing on my knees. It was like the awakening. This is really happening.
It was phenomenal. It was life-changing for us.
Over the following week, she says God began to strengthen her legs. 3 weeks later, she walked in front of her own congregation for the first time. Dahlia leads worship at Living Word Christian Church in Mobile, where her husband is the pastor. She also dances with him every chance she gets.
I think it's a really pretty story, and in none of these examples do any of these problems ever come back. The blindness and the MS, Dr. Sean George obviously will eventually die and could have heart problems, but he didn't die immediately after his miracle, right? And then with Dahlia Knox, I mean, she was still walking around and gets to enjoy being with her husband and dancing together. I have one other example that I'm going to include in a link in the description. It's an honorable mention for sure. It's Bruce Van Natta, who was smashed by a semi-truck, or like a diesel engine truck, one of those. His intestines grew back and were fully functioning, and man, it's just such a wild story. So if you're interested in the miracle stories, I would definitely check his out. If you like the videos, great. Stay tuned for the next video. And if you don't, or if you have comments or questions, concerns, feel free to either message me on Facebook or message on these videos. Thank you for watching. I hope this was insightful. Yeah, have a good day. Take care. God bless. Peace.